Welcome back. Welcome to the afternoon session of the conference. We talk about Silicon Valley. We'll be having a keynote and then a panel discussion. You're very much invited to take part. I see there's several people who know that tech stuff, so please take your notes during the keynote. There will be no Q&A directly after the keynote, but we will have plenty of time to discuss all together during the panel discussion. But first, let me introduce you to the keynote speaker. He comes from Stanford University. He's a professor of comparative literature. He's German. He also directs the Michel Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University. And you might know him from his contributions to Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Zeit, and so on. So he contributes to a lot of German quality newspapers. And normally, he specializes in the 19th century. So he writes about four-handed piano playing in German literature, or on the metaphysics of marriage in German idealism and romanticism. Fascinating stuff. We'd love to hear about it, but you're not here for that. You're here for Silicon Valley. He wrote a book that's called What Tech Calls Thinking, an inquiry into the intellectual bedrock of Silicon Valley. And that's why he's here. And please welcome Adrian Daub.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Botstiber Institute and to the Diplomatische Akademie. I'm really excited to get to talk to you about this today. And this is in some way a talk about my book, but not of my book, because in some way writing the book was a study in what exactly I understood to be Silicon Valley. And then meeting people who read the book and going to events about the book over the last 2 years has sort of been a study what questions people have and what questions people bring to that place. And this is something that I've become more and more fascinated with. And so my question about maintaining and exporting this mythos really doesn't come out of my book at all, but out of the experience of talking to readers of it, both within Silicon Valley and outside of it. So I'm really excited to get to talk with you today about the export item named Silicon Valley. I think it's fair to say that Europeans have become rather fascinated with it, maybe fixated on it. And this will be one of the observations that I hope you'll agree with. I can't prove this, but I think this is true. Have become at this point maybe more fixated on it than Americans. I do think that there's a kind of exoticism that attached to Silicon Valley in the US context that it has, for better or for worse, lost. I would say it's probably largely for the good, but I don't think that's true in Europe entirely. And I'll say more about that in a second. When I talk here about mythos, I'm not going to really define mythos too tightly, partly because I know that several of the speakers going after me will take it in different directions, and I don't want to sort of, this isn't about different versions of this word. We're all describing one thing, and we're all trying to grapple with this allure, right, which has something to do with how it orders our reality, how it orders our present, how it promises a particular kind of future. And so I'm not going to define it. But what I will say is, I might gesture to is three dimensions of a possible definition, right? Don't you know, he's dead now, but don't call Hans Blumenberg and get him to haul me off the stage. Like, that's wrong. I just want you to hear them in the back of your head as I'm talking about these today. Right, one thing that we say when we're saying that Silicon Valley is a mythos is that this is an industry that, and I would think we could say to an unusual extent, relies on big narratives and big, bold claims to project its business model, right? Obviously, every industry does that, right? If a car company couldn't tell you that a car will make you feel free, like, why would you ever sit in one? But the tech industry really relied on a kind of claim to being the avant-garde, being the future, to an extent that other industries, I think, at least no longer do. They may have at some point. Right? It has a kind of lighthouse function, shows us where the journey is going, and that's both necessary for the hype that you get from Silicon Valley companies, which is deeply necessary in an industry that often runs on pretty outsized promises, right? The famous example of this being Uber, which is still promising to investors that it will one day be profitable. And I'm assuming that the investors invested in this company in hopes that it will be profitable. And the story of how it will be profitable changes every few years. But that shining goal has to be reached narratively. It has to be reached kind of almost mythologically. This is where things are going, trust us. Right? But on the other hand, of course, and I want to be very careful about this, this lighthouse function can also be true of people who are very leery of these companies. That is to say, if you think that Mark Zuckerberg knows exactly what he's doing and it's all terrible, well, you might be buying into a similar mythos, right? Like his power is equal whether or not or his power over your imagination is equal whether or not you think what he's doing is terrible or whether you think it's visionary, right? Or some combination thereof. The power is the constant here. The other thing that I think that mythos does, and this is sort of what first got me interested in this topic, this kind of mythos inspires, well, I could say pilgrimages. One of the first things that I noticed as I was starting to really think about the tech industry while teaching at Stanford, right in the heart of Silicon Valley, was just how many European politicians and economic leaders were always on campus. I once literally bumped into the German Minister of Health at the time while rushing to my class late. I was like, I know this guy from the Tagesschau, this is bizarre. And I would imagine that if I taught at the University of Minnesota, that would not be happening to me, right? People come to Stanford, come to Silicon Valley for very specific reasons. I'm calling it now a pilgrimage. I was later apprised by someone who works actually in a German tech company. They refer to them as safaris. So when I thought we were the shrine, the temple to be visited, we were the rhinos. we were the zoo animals. But whatever it is, like there's a whole set of devotional practices associated with this this particular promise. Now, if you've ever been to these places, and I'm guessing some of you have, you'll know that there's to purloin a often misapplied quote from Gertrude Stein about the city of Oakland. There's no there. It's really hard to see anything. These companies are pretty good about keeping, showing you flashy, colorful things and none of the things that make them rich, right? So you see people rolling around on cool scooters, but you don't see anything that would tell you something. But people, come on well-financed safaris to see it. There's some meaning to be gotten from that. I have been fascinated with it. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it really exists, but I think that's what the mythos is. It's the thing that makes that trip, that makes that pilgrimage, that makes that safari meaningful. So that's one understanding of mythos. The other is, I think, the thing that probably drives people into the position where they want to come to these places and check them out. And one should say, well, I'll say more about what exactly one checks out when one checks out Silicon Valley. But, the myths are stories we live with and that we use. They can provide some kind of guidance. They assign meaning to, on first glance, potentially meaningless seeming phenomena, right? So one reason the look towards Silicon Valley is, even if it's disquieting, is ultimately reassuring, is that this is a sense, you know where time's arrow is pointing. It's pointing there, right? You might like it, you might not like it. It seems to hold at bay the much scarier suggestion that no one knows, and that these are just maybe some better con artists than everyone else who's selling you a future, right? That they are making exactly the same guesses that everyone else is making. But I do think there's a tremendous reassurance in thinking, someone like Elon Musk has it figured out. And then finally, and this is the part where the critical theorist in me comes out, we might think of mythos in the sense of the way Roland Barthes uses it in his famous book Mythologies, in German I think Mythen des Alltags, right? Mythology makes a certain order of things, a certain hierarchy plausible to itself, explains why it is that way, why the world is constituted in this way and not some other way, and it creates affective buy-in, it creates emotional buy-in into its power structures, right? It says what is possible, it says what is desirable, and it gives us a way to emotionally attach to that. So I won't be focusing on any of these three exclusively, but I'm hoping you'll hear them in the background as I talk about myth, right? So we have big epic narrative, we have a kind of story that guides you, and we have a story that justifies an order, that justifies a particular constitution of the world. And I should say right away, right, all of these myths can be either positive or negative, not in the sense that they're good or bad, but in the sense that you can be guided by a dystopian vision, right? You can be, I think that many of us who donned a mask over the last 2 years probably thought of, a movie like Outbreak as like the thing that kept us doing that, right? Like that is a guiding mythic image in that moment, right? Myths can be dire warnings or glowing promises, right? And so I want to be very careful because I don't want to be this Californian who comes here and insults people in Europe. When I say that, I'm going to eventually argue that Europeans are a bit more credulous about these myths. And by that, I do not mean that I think Europeans are too positive vis-a-vis Facebook or something like that. Much to the contrary. I think that there is more, Europeans seem more ready to me to imbue what's happening in Silicon Valley with meaning at a moment when people in the United States, I think, are starting to abandon that position. Not that anyone thinks it's better or worse. It's just where meaning is to be sought in this space. Okay, so my remarks today will, this was all preamble, my apologies. My remarks today will fall into 3 parts. So first, I do want to make that claim plausible that there is a divergence between European and American relationships to the mythos of Silicon Valley over, let's say, the last 5 to 6 years. Let's call it 2016 and onwards for no reason whatsoever. Don't know what happened then, but and then secondly, I want to talk about where that divergence might come from. And then I want to get to the specific case of Austria, of the EU, of Europe, and think about what do Europeans specifically seem to make out of Silicon Valley, right? What is it good for in Europe? So 2 simple observations to start with, but maybe one of them really needs to be said because it becomes less clear the further away one moves from the actual space that is being described by that pars pro toto. So first, it concerns the question of who is the mythagogue? Who created this myth, right? And the answer, I think, is not necessarily the companies that we think of as Silicon Valley, right? The mythos around Silicon Valley, of course, is to some extent of its own making, but not entirely, or maybe largely not, right? The mythologies around Silicon Valley are told by stakeholders like policymakers, by investors, by journalists, by academics, and some of these you can show get internalized only in a second step by the companies themselves, right? Because in the end, these are consumer product companies. If you like their product, they don't have to think that hard about what they're doing. And so they may well absorb an interpretation that is furnished by, what I guess we would now call thought leaders. So someone who occupies a space between a decision maker, a regulator, a politician, and a kind of interpreter, hermeneut of this set of economic activities. So when I'm talking about maintaining and exporting a mythos, I'm not actually talking about 2 stages of the same process. I'm not saying first they created a mythos and then they figured out how the rest of the world would swallow it. This is a co-creation, right? The maintenance of an external image is an important aspect of the inner workings of Silicon Valley. It guides the flow of attention and capital, right? It also, very importantly in the United States, tends to stay attempts at regulation, right? Think of what narratives of inevitability are very frequently in the United States about the fact that, well, then there's no point for the federal government to regulate us, which for some of these companies is absolutely crucial, right? So that's a good example of where the external image actually is central to the business model, and then vice versa, that a lot of self-definition only comes through when challenged, right? Like when you have to justify what you're actually doing. So that's the first point. This isn't a mythology made in Silicon Valley. This is not, Instagram might come from Silicon Valley. Thinking about Instagram is does not come from there. And then second, I think it's really important to say, and I think that several of the other speakers will talk about this as well, so I will keep it brief, but there is no clear referent for the pars pro toto of Silicon Valley, right? Whether we're thinking about it in terms of geography, or in terms of culture, in terms of business model, financing model, or anything else, any other thing that you want to project onto it, you're going to find tons of outliers. You're going to pick out a couple of usually spectacular examples, and for almost every example, if I ask my friends who actually work in the tech industry, are they all like that? They can give me 10 examples of companies that function totally differently, right? Are they obsessed with scale? The ones we all know of, yes. The ones that we don't know, no, and that's why we don't know of them. So it's a really there are companies sort of getting lumped in to the tech space and into Silicon Valley, even though they don't belong, right? There are ones that desperately want to get lumped in because that's how they sell themselves to the media or to their investors. Very famously, WeWork, right, which everyone kept saying this is you're realtors, you're renting space, and they're like, no, we're a tech company, and they kept insisting on that until it turned out they were a realty company. There's nothing wrong with that, but the tech became a way to mystify what was a ultimately fairly traditional, though innovative form of renting office space. And then there are companies that are not considered part of Silicon Valley and probably should be, that really have imbibed something really, really interesting and important. And especially in the biotech sector, there are really interesting distinctions that I don't often understand, but where it would be really helpful to know exactly how they plan to do something, right? A good example of this is, thanks to the spectacular failure of Theranos, you can sort of see what their promise was, right? In the beginning, that really was a tech company. The idea was that the way you could get from the tiny pinprick of blood to large amounts of data was going to be AI. But then eventually it was just, they were going to take more and more of your blood, which of course is not, that is a technology, but not the technology we're talking about, right? And it's really important to think about the fact that the discursive object Silicon Valley constitutes itself every time anew when we talk about it, right? Each time you're going to leave things out, you're going to catch things, and you're going to catch some cultural practices and leave out others. And that's obviously even truer when a European gaze is directed at these companies, because one has to make a decision. What will we visit? Who do we want to talk to? Who do we invite? Right? These are, Vorurteile, prejudgments, not in any negative way, but like you will encounter what you seek, right? So the important consequence of these two observations for European and for Austrian relations to Silicon Valley is that, and I apologize if I'm quoting Jacques Lacan in a Viennese context, it must be sacrilege, is that there is no relationship in some way, by which I don't mean, like Lacan, that there aren't interesting and important dynamics that play out, transfers, that there are interactions between the tech space of Northern California, between tech more generally, between the United States, etc., and a place like Austria. Rather, it would mean that the relationship with Silicon Valley is, to some extent, also always, or above all, a self-relationship. It's a way to figure out, it's a way to interrogate oneself by interrogating this faraway place. I'm really glad that Kafka's Amerika came up earlier, because it's kind of the same thing, right? It's America as an internal landscape kind of projected onto the Pacific surf, if you will, right? Right. However real the companies that stand behind this moniker, someone has to choose to have them stand in for this industry, for this relationship one wants to have. So the second consequence is that the mythos of Silicon Valley is not the same mythos everywhere, and doesn't function, or it doesn't serve the same function depending on where you go. And like I say, I became very fascinated by the way, after publishing my book, the questions I would get after the French edition came out were very different from the ones when the German edition came out. And it is clearly because this object pre-circulates in a particular discourse with a particular function. So that's what my subtitle here is for. What is it for, right? There's a reason Silicon Valley occupies a specific function in the discourse, has a certain status in mapping out the future, either as a warning, a challenge, or an inspiration, right? And so that's what I kind of want to get into today. So let me first talk about the development in the US, right? I think it's fair to say that largely Americans look at these companies differently than 5 years ago, right? Left, right, center, Californians, Texans, New Yorkers, Floridians, everyone has pretty markedly cooled, I think, in their relationship to these companies. I'll later be talking about a lag between American reception and European reception, but I don't know if that's actually the right way to put it. It's possible that there are misgivings that pre-existed in Europe that have now become accepted in the US. For now, I want to just very simply draw on my experience as a Californian who recently wandered off an airplane into Europe after a long time away, and to kind of show how differently Silicon Valley impinges on everyday life in its various iconographies. So here are two slides from the United States. This is two Elon Musk covers from 2013 and 2022, and I think I'm hoping I'm not going to do as good a job as the art historians, so my apologies, but I think there's a lot to be looked at here. For one thing, Elon Musk still requires a label in 2013, such innocent times, right? He's there with the sextant, he's measuring out uncharted distances, he's plotting a course. He and his tools seem to kind of stand in for a long tradition of inventors, right? The 50 greatest inventions since the wheel. Like he's the latest in a long line. Also, it's a white man at the end of a long line of inventors. That's probably not an accident either, but I won't talk about that too much. And then, right, and in some way also continuity with a sextant, I would say, of European exploration, right? This is an extension. This is a man who already had founded SpaceX, as it's sort of, he's the new Columbus, right? This is very much in that tradition. 2022 image from Time looks very different, right? We have Musk holding a caged Twitter bird, or a bunch of them, right? And the idea seems to be that he sets the limits of our world, right? That the limits of his thinking very quickly will become the limits of our everyday lived experience, right? And then I really like the kind of spiked pinky at the top there, which kind of suggests to kind of let them eat cake detachment, right, from the concerns of whoever he's looking at. There's an Abgehobenheit to this image that I think is important. So the trajectory, I'll get to that in a second, but the trajectory that leads from that first image to the second is one of disenchantment, one of an integration of a semi-mythic figure into the very recognizable operations of power, right? And of our world, right? He's very much brought down to earth in this. The same thing can be shown with regard to television and literature, right? So on the left you have a novel by Neil Stephenson from 2015, Seven Eves. I don't know if anyone of you have read this. I don't know if I'd necessarily recommend it. It is another one of these novels of planetary catastrophe, although utterly inescapable and unavoidable planetary catastrophe. And there is a billionaire figure that might as well be called Elon Musk, but is not, who sort of single-handedly tries to save humanity from extinction. And that's indeed a topic that Elon Musk himself has spoken very passionately about. It's a really interesting book in that I'm not going to spoil it, but this figure is ultimately very, very positive. and embraces his vision of species survival. The idea, the 7 Eves of this title are 7 humans who will indeed survive a planetary apocalypse and will then seed a new, in fact, 7 new human species 10,000 years into the future, right? And you can already hear the kind of creepy, we already talked about the post-human or the anti-humanist inclinations of certain Silicon Valley billionaires, right? When Elon Musk, for instance, famously said that space represents hope, what he means is, chillingly enough, it represents the hope of survival for some very few humans, while the rest of us go down the tubes. But here this is still sort of taken seriously and taken and entertained as a potentially salvific attitude to take towards the human race. Although even in 2016 there were attempts to spoof this. This is a fictional tweet, I should say, by the character of Gavin Belson, who's a billionaire on the HBO show Silicon Valley. So he's fake. He's mostly based on Sergey Brin and Jeff Bezos, but that tweet seems to me pure Elon Musk, right? He doesn't want to live in a world where someone else gets to make the world a better place. That has to be his job, right? And then the other shift that I didn't address in the slide, but I want to talk briefly about, there is also, just for the literary historian, there was a moment when there were exciting and interesting, well, partly exciting and partly interesting novels written about Silicon Valley, right? I'm not going to say that Dave Eggers' The Circle was one of them, but it was definitely highly regarded for a while. There was a famous book called I Hate the Internet that was formerly very adventurous. In German, Jonas Lüscher wrote the book Kraft, which is very much almost a ethnography of Silicon Valley, very, very closely observed. He spent quite a long time there. And we've moved on from that, and I think what you get now mostly are really interesting memoirs, right? And they're usually memoirs of disenchantment. They're usually memoirs looking back. The most famous one, or I would say also probably the best one, is Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener, which I think has been translated, but I don't know as what. But I like the American title because, once again, we're in Vienna. This is about, the Uncanny Valley refers both to the representationality. Uncanny Valley refers to the gap that opens between a photorealistic simulation of reality and reality itself, but it also just talks about the fact that there's something deeply uncanny, unheimlich, about Silicon Valley. And there we might say, and this is where we can start pivoting to European and to Austrian reception, of course, that I think, as we saw during the last panel, a sense that, I don't know a European that feels the opposite of unheimlich in Silicon Valley, right? There's a kind of a Heimischkeit, a rootedness, a locatedness there is something that has always eluded the European perspective. And in some way, it seems like someone like Anna Wiener gets there where a lot of Europeans have already been. And I think that's a really interesting moment, because in fact, that is often also a moment when European thinkers and the EU specifically become an interesting interlocutor, right? You end up, if you become uprooted from Silicon Valley, if you can no longer be located there, then the European perspective becomes a very effective mode of decentering, of not belonging in Silicon Valley. To quote another book that was mentioned, Theodor Adorno's Minima Moralia, right? There's a categorical imperative, he writes in Minima Moralia, to not be at home in your own home, right? And if that is taken seriously in Silicon Valley, the look is in fact often back to Europe, right? Is in fact back to the EU, yeah? Right. So, so as I said, I'm a little leery of being the Californian that comes to Europe to tell the Europeans they're somehow falling behind or are behind the times or something like that. But I do want to say this, that it does seem to me that with respect to the mythos, it really does feel like it's still 2016 in Europe. This is what Der Stern had as its cover on Elon Musk recently, right? this is very much, right? I mean, from the Caravagesque lighting to the beatific expression, this feels very, very removed from what you see in the Time cover, for instance. Right? There's a willingness to kind of engage with the mythos still in a way that they wouldn't in the US. And then just as one further, I found this recently. This was parked just a block away from my apartment in Berlin, and I'll just quote the noted expert who is my husband, who pointed this out to me and said, "Wow, if you parked that in San Francisco right now, someone would take a hammer to it, right? Like you couldn't physically park this anywhere in San Francisco right now, but somehow the idea that you could sort of pun on his name and like that's cute rather than utterly terrifying has retained a cachet here, right?" And I should say that in terms of media, just to finish my media survey here, in the US, the most powerful icons to come out of Silicon Valley these days are probably the TV shows that are made about it. It seems like almost every of the big unicorns by now has its own TV show, right? This is Super Pumped, where Joseph Gordon-Levitt plays Travis Kalanick, former CEO of Uber. Here is, of course, Amanda Seyfried as Elizabeth Holmes in The Dropout, is the Theranos story. And then here is Jared Leto and Anne Hathaway in the WeWork movie that you did not know we needed, called We Crashed. And I think it's really two very small points here as from a media historical angle, which is to say, this is, of course, the moment where American prestige TV sort of tries to lay hold of Silicon Valley, but it's also a merging of two narrative modes that are, I would say, have a long and deep tradition in US television, which is, this is what we would call true crime, right? One thing that all three of these TV shows have in common is that they're based on podcasts. They're all kind of trying to sort of tell you the behind the scenes story and think that watching very rich people haggle over how to defraud each other is extremely enlightening in some weird way. It is very much, it's very much kind of in the vein of a true crime story, and I think that says something already. That the narrative mode that seems to most excite people makes them want to hear stories about Silicon Valley is one that has crime in the name, is likely not great advertising, right? It suggests that there's really been a decrease here in stature to some extent. Okay, now to my second part, and I'll just leave their unblinking eyes up there for a second. This is my last slide. I'm sorry. From now on, it's just going to be my voice. What accounts for this divergence, right? So I think, on the one hand, the European reception does recapitulate some of the misprisions that characterized the U.S. Focus or gaze on Silicon Valley, right down to these things, right? That there was a thought that just because a company is big, it's interesting to find out why it failed, right? Big companies fail, small companies fail. Unclear. We have shows with spaceships and dragons. I don't know why you need Jared Leto renting out space in New York City. It's not the pitch that I would wait for if I was a television producer. But so there are certain recapitulations, right? Kind of maximalism, a kind of focus on cultural signifiers. So each of these shows has to have them like drink their weird shakes. They have to the camera has to swoop through open floor plan offices, right? Plenty of Silicon Valley companies don't have those. If you want, if you want to rent cheap space in an expensive market, you take what you can get, right? But on camera or on screen, it always has to be, this big, like cavernous space where people roll around on scooters and whatever. And of course, that's true for some of these companies. It's also untrue for many others. But right, so this taking cultural signifiers as stand-ins for the business model, a kind of confusion between the business model and financing model, right? The fact that All these are financial crime shows, and never do you meet a venture capitalist, or very rarely do you meet a venture capitalist. It's never quite explained how they do their work, right? Which in most of these cases is one of the most important questions, right? And the most interesting question, namely that, like, they're not actually that mad if you defraud them of a few $1 billion, as long as the next person makes even more money, right? So there's a really interesting thing here where there are these misprisions that I think are absolutely characteristic of the US discourse, but that are true in Europe as well. But that's, I think, where the differences start. Both in the US and in Europe, the gaze turned towards Silicon Valley, right? It's not always been there. It's not always been attached to it in quite this way. It began attaching itself to it at a moment when other sectors of the economy could no longer furnish any heroes, right? When other parts of the economy, especially after the financial crash of 2008, lost their ability to project a coherent story about the future, right? Future both in terms of our shared human future and in a much more limited way, you know, how one might be wealthier tomorrow than one was today. Right? In the US, for instance, real estate was one way in which capitalism was able to furnish a promise of future prosperity, of an escape from the trap of deindustrialization, et cetera, right? And after 2008, it became kind of Silicon Valley or bust. You know? When it came to capitalism imagining a future for itself, Silicon Valley was, after 2008, at least for a while, pretty much the only game in town. So you can already tell that the story I just told is ultimately more American than European, right? The real estate market, for instance, functioned very differently after the 2008 financial crisis over here. But in a strange way, the idea that the future, singular, is somehow identical with tech and with the work processes associated with certain tech companies, and with, you know, it has proven more durable here than it has in the US. Since 2016, the ability of Silicon Valley to really pass itself off as having a coherent and viable vision for the future has basically taken a number of hits. I'll give maybe, you know, in some way these shows already give a good accounting of this. I could just talk about these three, but maybe I'll just talk about this one. Right, in the fall of 2020, Californians passed Proposition 22. Propositions, you may know, are direct referenda that are decided by all voters in California, and they're justly infamous. Californians tend to be very reasonable in which politicians they vote for, and then tend to go a little off the rails when it comes to voting for their own taxes or things like that. And even by those standards, this one was pretty incredible. It was the California Supreme Court had held that rideshare drivers were in fact part-time employees and were owed by the big rideshare companies a certain amount of benefits, not those of regular employees, but they had to create a new category for that. Proposition 22 was literally just saying that's not true. We're going to write it into the California Constitution that these people are just, in spite of what you might think, are not in fact employees of Uber or Lyft or DoorDash were the three big ones that sued, that tried to put this on the ballot. And indeed they won. I believe it passed with something like 75–80% of the vote. No, actually probably like 65% of the vote. But in the event, you know, while they won, it was also a really interesting watershed moment in terms of its campaign, in the sense that you could imagine, you know, I was just publishing my book, so I was very ready for all the think pieces, all the interesting, you know, philosophy that was going to come out of this to explain to us why these people who were so obviously employees were not in fact employees. Well, none of that came. The strategy they ran was basically that of a tobacco company that didn't want to have tobacco taxes raised. It was they had abandoned. They did not try to make an appeal to, you know, all the values that allegedly guide these companies. They said, well, your ride will be more expensive, and we may have to quit California. You wouldn't like that, right? So absolutely the way any monopolist would react if you challenged them. And I think that it was an implicit kind of, in the fall of 2020, it was a kind of acknowledgement, we are now like other companies. We're big enough that we can be like other companies. All that other stuff, all the colorful ideals, don't worry about them. We're gonna behave like other companies do, right? And I think it's a really interesting watershed moment, and it's also the moment where another kind of Übereinkunft, another kind of entente within the Valley broke up, which was to say that one group that spoke out publicly against Proposition 22 vociferously were employees of the companies themselves, especially the programmers who were employees, right? Who in some way, frankly, made money off of the fact that these drivers did not make a whole lot of money. But they spoke up and said, these people are obviously our employees. They should be allowed to unionize, right? And there was there's a really interesting moment where not only did the companies kind of abandon talk of supposed ideals, it was very clear that the people working at these companies no longer believed them either. And very significantly didn't quit, right? No one quit, I don't think anyone quit Uber over this. But they put pressure on their employer. They said, this needs to change, right? They sort of, the whole language in Silicon Valley up to that point had been, right, the mission. We don't do business. We have a mission, right? The famous phrase was always down for the cause, right? We don't have a business model. We have a cause, right? We want to bring people together, or whatever it is, right? Make the world a better place, not be evil, right? And this was a kind of a general recognition from management and from people working at these companies to say, this is a workplace like any other. If I don't like it, I can organize, right? So I think it's a really interesting moment of kind of demythification, but also a kind of moment of growing up, right? This was a moment when the fact that these companies' workforces are also aging, right? That really kind of redounded to a real change in the thinking. And who really still bought into the myths that we were talking about, right? I'll give one other example maybe before I go to my third part. I think I'm running a little behind. Okay, then I'll skip my example. The other example is just going to be Twitter, which I think we've all talked about plenty. And so I do want to talk in my third part, right? So if we are in this shift within Silicon Valley, why then is there this kind of continued fascination? Why does this fascination endure in Europe? And my point will be that on the one hand, there is a greater readiness to believe that these things, there's greater belief in these myths. And secondly, my point will be that there is at the same time a kind of virtuality to the relationship. That is to say, the fact that it's over there, the fact that it's distant, the fact that it's not quite real, the way Californian things tend to not be quite real, is a feature and not a bug. Right? So my point is not that Europe is somehow behind in some forfeited development, but rather that this lag in our respective labors on myth indicates that the mythology fulfilled actually very different functions in Europe and the US to begin with. Right? So why Silicon Valley? Very briefly, there are a couple of very obvious points I want to get out of the way. Silicon Valley is the mode towards globality within, I think, the European context, thinking about a relationship to the world and to broader and structures felt to be universal. That's also a myth, that structures created in Silicon Valley are universal. They're not. But it is still a gesture towards universality. It's a nice way to, in German I'd say Entgrenzung, right? It's a way of delimiting yourself. Secondly, Silicon Valley also functions very nicely as an icon on the potential decrease of sovereignty, especially state sovereignty. Right, becomes a way to tell the story of a decrease of sovereignty and to navigate anxieties around that. That is to say, this is a continent where national states are giving up sovereignty, and there are anxieties about this. On the other hand, there's a push, let's say, from some Silicon Valley billionaires to sort of reconceive, corporate sovereignty as actually being preceding national sovereignty. You can see how these things sort of enter into a dialogue, into a set of dialogues with each other. I'm happy to say more about that later. So we're in a space where in the US, the relationship is considering between the Silicon Valley and the public is reconfiguring itself. In Europe, it has remained the same. The myth has remained the same, and I think it is the main reason I want to drive at in my closing is that Europe, and I think this is true, I know this is true for Germany, this is my perception true of Austria, that Europeans are interested in the myth as myth. That is to say, they consume it as mythical. They understand that it's to some extent fictional, and that makes it easier to use, right? The reason the fiction survived here longer is that it was, at least when it came to European realities, always understood as a fiction, as something that one could dream about, one could project oneself into, something one could warn about, or about which one could make dire predictions. Ever since I've lived in Silicon Valley, and ever since I've lived in San Francisco, I've had European media ask me, for instance, about the end of both places, and I never understand what that means, right? I think it says a lot about what kind of an imagination is at work here, because whatever would be ending, right, if it's the end of Silicon Valley, the end of San Francisco, what does that mean? It wouldn't be the places themselves. It would be something analogous to what my Stanford colleague Hans-Ulrich Gumbrecht called, the world spirit in Silicon Valley, right? It moves on, and that's what's ending, right? The companies aren't going to fall into the ocean. Something about its magical connection to the zeitgeist that would ultimately change. And my ultimate argument would be this, and I'll leave you with that. Silicon Valley is and remains, I think, for Europeans an excuse to imagine themselves as less committed to a kind of European sovereignty, to imagine themselves far more libertarian than they ever actually are, right? It's a sense to dangle a toe into imagining a kind of, imagining deregulated markets, and then to kind of walk the other way, right? Which made kind of the fictionality of these myths of Silicon Valley an asset rather than a liability. Europe got to dream its own dreams alongside those of Silicon Valley. Ultimately, what people wanted from Silicon Valley was something dramatic, an alternate reality, we might even say a metaverse, that they experienced almost as science fiction because it was so distinct from what policy making, what regulatory environment, and what the political environment was like here. And I would say with Nietzsche, it's profoundly, it's the least Dionysian intoxication with Silicon Valley imaginable. It's utterly Apollonian. It's very much lucid dreaming. Silicon Valley was, to use another metaphor, a user surface, a helpful graphic ordering of ideas, of problems, but with little relationship to the sort of reality underneath. And the question that interests me these days, and one which I, as a scholar of European culture, have no answer for as of yet, and the question that therefore I will leave you with, is what if that user surface goes away? We could think of this as the 21st century version of Nietzsche's famous heaviest weight fragment about the death of God. What happens if this ordering function goes away? What comes then, right? What if the user surface goes away? What if this is what we mean by the end of Silicon Valley, that the last simulacrum by which we think we can map out our future reliably, whether for good or for ill, falls away? And the thought I'll leave you with, because it came up earlier, is that the need to kind of logocentrically suppose that there is a place where digitality is already lived and where the digital future is here and where we can see what it's going to look like, is, I think, it's maybe with digital nativeness, the same way it is with national essences, right? It's always over there. It's always somewhere else. And maybe in the end, we'll find out that Californians are no more digital natives than Europeans. And in the end, we've all been, and I'll leave you with that thought, digital Caucasians. So thank you very much. And I look forward to discussing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian Daub, for this excellent keynote. Thank you. That will be a great starting point. I must say, I disagree with so many points you made. That will make for an interesting discussion. I don't know about the other panelists, but we'll have a short coffee break before going into this, and you're very much invited to take part in the discussion after that. So grab a coffee, and we'll be back. Is 10 minutes okay for you? Then we would be 5 minutes ahead of after the time that we should start. So let's do 10 minutes and start again at 25 to 3, okay? Have a nice break. So now we're going into the panel discussion, which also starts with 3 short presentations by the panelists. So we thought it would be better if they do it one after the other so that everybody can see the presentations, and then we'll gather here for the discussion on the podium. So our first panelist and presenter is professor at the College of Business at Oregon State University, and she's holding the Fulbright Catherine and Craig Hall Distinguished Chair for Entrepreneurship in Central Europe at the WU, the Wirtschaftsuniversität in Vienna, since 2019 now, but you have a long track record with this university. And her research areas span from China to the United Arab Emirates, from tech to entrepreneurship, so she's got the full picture. Welcome, Julie Ann Elston. Please, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I'd also like to thank Ambassador Brex of the Diplomatische Akademie for inviting me here. Michael Burry, the Botstiber Foundation, you're here somewhere, and Henrietta Egerth of Fulbright, Austria, for the invitation to come here and speak a little bit. That was a fantastic, lecture we heard from you, Adrian, and I loved reading your book. It gave me a lot of ideas about what tech is and where it's going. I actually worked at Stanford for a year in 1995, so I am familiar with the vibe, the excitement of the technology industry and all that comes with it. And I do appreciate, however, a critical view of what that means. So my perspective is a little different from Adrian's. I'm an economist by training, so using a little bit of economic history, let me see if I can get this to work. Voila. I'd like to bring up the work of Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, who is not only responsible for many insights on creative destruction and entrepreneurship, but also pointed out that technological innovation is a primary driver behind the Chondroitin Innovation cycles. I bring this up because one of the claims of tech, speaking of tech myths, is how exceptional it is. Well, in fact, historically, I didn't mean to go back in time when I said historically. What I wanted to talk about is the Chondroitin cycles. And if you look at these cycles, you will see that there is a peak every 50 years. In other words, there is a new innovation that comes out that changes the way that everything is done and boosts the economy. So, for example, if we go back to the 1800s, we had the innovation of the steam engine, which helped in the cotton industry. It was used in the cotton mills and supported the textile industry and was a huge boost to economic development in the United Kingdom. In 1850, there was steel in the railways, in the railroads, which boosted transportation, engineering, chemistry, and electricity came around about in the 1900s. Electricity was actually invented in 1752, but it wasn't until the late 1800s, early 1900s with the Edison Company that we really saw electricity being widely available in firms and in residences. So fast forward then to 1950, and we have the Petrochemical Innovations, which came about, petroleum refinement, rubber, the invention of the car by Otto Benz in Germany, and of course the mass production which Ford developed in the United States, which made automobiles affordable, okay? So when we roll around to about 2000, 2020, which is current history, if you will, we see that we have the information economy. And so in some sense, it's just another innovation. So the title of my talk is Technology Like Detroit. In some ways, it is just like Detroit. It's another innovation within an innovation cycle. There have been innovations before, and there will probably be innovations afterwards as well. So how do we keep innovation going? I mean, I think everybody is familiar with what a good thing technology can be. It isn't always, but can be. And one of the keys we want to think about is the role of regulation, which is not a topic, surprisingly enough, which comes up very often when you discuss entrepreneurship and technology. Innovation is dependent on a supportive regulatory structure and also to mitigate social and environmental costs of new technologies. So think back to the automobile, right? When automobiles came out, there wasn't a lot of regulation. There wasn't any initially, right? Automobile industry did not want to be regulated, but when people became aware that there was pollutants that came from cars, then the Environmental Protection Agency, and again, California kind of spearheaded that, required that people attach catalytic converters to their cars to reduce pollutants. So addressing the social and environmental costs, there is an argument for regulation to reduce some of the negative externalities that come from technology, including such things as data privacy, data piracy, fraud, misinformation, and fake news. There was some discussion yesterday and a little bit today about the role of fake news as being a danger to the public interests and a danger to the democratic processes. And that's something that we need to think about. The other point is actually what I've labeled, sorry about that, I'm not very good at changing my own slides. Point one is another reason why we want to think about regulation. So a lot of the firms, as Adrian pointed out, at least at this point, are monopolists within the tech industry. And we all know that monopolists have to be regulated because they are involved with predatory pricing. And they tend to, if left unregulated, often stamp out innovation. This is why the Federal Trade Commission has filed a lawsuit against Facebook because of their buy or bury strategy, which is seen as predatory pricing and behavioral strategy. Remember, it's not illegal to be a monopolist, it's illegal to behave like one. So it's the predatory pricing and behavior that the regulations generally try and go after. On the internet side, the US Federal Communications Commission, FCC, has declared that the internet is in fact another natural monopoly. When I say natural monopoly, I mean it's a monopoly because of the sheer scale. You only need to develop one internet and then you can service many users from that. The same way that you only put one dam on a river. You don't need multiple dams. Once you've built that dam, however, you have a natural monopoly. And without regulation, that monopolist would charge higher prices. So many feel that the FCC and the FTC are not sufficient for regulation of these sectors. And part of this conference here today has been, really the focus of this conference is US-Austrian progress in recharging things. And one area where Austria has really jumped ahead, and I have to say at the EU level, because I'm not aware of any Austrian-specific rules on this, but the EU has really provided a first in the field of digital regulation. And many view this as the gold standard that we can look forward to on regulation for digital services. The EU Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act of 2022, which will take effect in 2023 next year, were designed to promote transparency on algorithms and content moderation practices, as well as to address antitrust issues. The DSA monitors illegal content. Basically, what's illegal off the internet is going to be illegal on the internet. And they are also requiring platforms to mitigate disinformation and cyber violence. There's a lot of other components of these acts. I'm just touching the surface on some of the more important aspects of their regulatory structure. The second, the Digital Markets Act, has positioned itself to regulate the gatekeepers. Those are the platforms of Amazon, Google, and Meta for anti-competitive behavior. What's most surprising to me about this body of regulation is that 4 of the 5 most valuable firms in the world are actually US digital firms. And yet the regulatory structure, the regulatory leadership is coming out of the EU. Now, that's pretty interesting. But I think what this presents us with is an opportunity to say, hey, maybe America should come to the policy table and think about a regulatory structure that it could have. And what its needs are. And if America continues not to do that, then there will be other people making those decisions. These are global firms, and at this point, what is in place in the US is considered by many people in the policy industry as being insufficient for this dynamic new industry. So I'll get to the leading question, which I actually stole from one of Adrian's talks that I found on the internet. Is tech different than Detroit? Well, as you can imagine, it's a yes-no answer on that, okay? No, it's not different than Detroit in the fact that it is another innovation in an innovation cycle, okay? Which doesn't suggest that it's so exceptional that it doesn't need any regulatory oversight whatsoever. Is it different in other ways? Yeah, I would say that it is. It's more complex, most likely, more complex than, say, the automobile is. And because of that, it probably needs a very mindful structure for regulation, one that takes into account that part of it is physical, that is the internet, and part of it is virtual. And any regulation that comes up, of course, would ideally harmonize with the existing regulatory structure which has been developed in the EU. So if I would like to present one point of discussion or challenge today, it would be for what our thoughts are on how this regulatory process can and should proceed from the US side. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing regulation into the discussion. I think that's one of the main discussion points that we should have in this topic. Thanks for bringing that. Now, our next speaker is managing partner at WebLizard Technology here in Vienna. He's a professor for information system at the Research Center for New Media Technology at the Modul University here in Vienna. And previously, he was a professor in Western Australia at the Graz University, and he also was a visiting fellow at UC Berkeley, so right there. And he researches on web intelligence, big data, opinion mining, and so on. So please welcome on stage Arno Scharl.
So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. As you have witnessed today, there are various ways you can tackle the problem of myth-making. There are various scientific disciplines. We have had presentations of social sciences and the economic sciences. And I'm going to add another dimension, which is the information systems research. More precisely, semantic technologies. It's already in the term itself. Semantic is the study of meaning, and already today we heard, how important the concept of meaning is to myth-making, and that actually myth-making is based on co-creation processes. Co-creation processes by various different stakeholders. And it might be triggered by a particular group with a goal in mind, but then it's often self-reinforcing and amplified by others, modified by others. And some of these stakeholders were mentioned. It's politicians, it's journalists, it might be investors, and they all leave digital traces. So they publish on news outlets, they publish on stakeholder websites, they publish through social media. So they leave a lot of digital traces when they produce content. And semantic technologies are AI-driven knowledge extraction algorithms with the goal to analyze this process automatically. Because when you're facing 100, 200 million publications, you cannot go and approach this manually. You need automated methods to aggregate this and to analyze this. And this is what this talk is about. We also heard about the effective buy-in, that effective variables, effective models are playing an important role. And you might be familiar with standard metrics such as share of voice and sentiment. And sentiment is the most simple effective model. It's just positive or negative. As you see also on this slide, there are much more granular models of human emotions that can also be measured automatically. So by aggregating all these traces of stakeholders as they contribute to myth-making and how they share the different perceptions on a topic, you capture that, you have a web crawler, you go to the data interfaces of these platforms, you aggregate it, and then you analyze it through semantic algorithms. There's also specific methods for perception biases, where you look at the world and see, well, how are different groups approaching this thing in terms of narrative. So it's the narrative, it's sometimes how you frame a story, but it's just a choice of words. Imagine just, there's one speaker who talks about Silicon Valley companies, and the other speaker talks about tech giants. There is a lot of, effective knowledge already contained in the term itself. You don't even have to look at the narrative around it. And then when you search for a topic in all this online coverage, you have to keep that in mind and phrase the query accordingly. That's a slide that should demonstrate that funding for technology and funding for information systems is not only in the US. There are actually quite a few of Austrian and European programs. We are participating in quite a few of them ourselves. So on the lower left corner, for example, Austrian Research Promotion Agency, we have a project called Gentio, where we evolve our underlying artificial intelligence stack. We have a project called Epoch, which looks at the prediction, because you can actually, from this public debate, you can not only analyze the past, but you can actually anticipate the future, because a lot of people are already talking about things they know are going to happen, or they think it might happen. So it can also be used for predictive purposes. Or one, which I think fits quite nicely to the myth-making, which is on explainable AI for detecting misinformation, because it's the same type of algorithms. If you want to analyze the perception in the US versus the perception in Austria, it's the same algorithm than if you look at one group that tries to spread misinformation and the other one that tries to get out the truth. I want to show you just a couple of examples without going into detail. So this is one of our visual analytics dashboard that we built to analyze these co-creation processes between stakeholders by taking a closer look at the information they're publishing. In the upper left corner, you see this is a query for Silicon Valley. So we're analyzing around 13,500 documents that were published on the websites that we monitor between January and now. And the colors that you see are actually representing where this coverage comes from. So it's a cross-lingual platform. So blue would be the opinions from the United States. Yellow in Spain, United Kingdom brown, Germany green, and Austria would be the orange color. So we use this color coding to segment all these co-creation processes We can track the stories over time as they emerge, what are the dominant keywords with the story. And on the right, you find a tech cloud. I think most of you will be familiar with the concept of a tech cloud. Here, the colors represent what one particular country associates with. So you see Austria, for example, we have terms like co-founder, acquisitions, gold rush. Would be, for example, specific associations in the current year from Austrian sources. Now we are switching to sentiment. Sentiment is this simple, effective model that I've mentioned. And it's actually quite interesting because it reflects a bit what we heard in the earlier talk, that actually if you look only at the German-speaking part, Germany and Austria, we see that, at least recently, they indeed have, on average, a more positive sentiment associated with their stories, which is also reflected, in terms like gold rush or so. Of course, that's something that has a positive connotation. What we can also see here are, for example, which persons are dominating the debate. So who is talked about in that coverage? And through that color coding, I think I have to stay close to the mic, through that color coding, you have personalities like Elon Musk, which also we have heard about the evolving coverage and how the narrative changes, that Elon Musk is actually talked in all the countries. So it's a truly global phenomenon, versus other people like Jack Dorsey, the Twitter founder, or Larry Ellison, the Oracle co-founder, they are only talked here in the Anglo-American news and journalist and stakeholder website. So there's a clear, some people are really a global phenomenon where you have other persons, inventors, for example, who are really more restricted. That was too quick. What you see on the lower right side is that it's actually possible not only to analyze, okay, what are people thinking about the Silicon Valley, but you can get actually much more granular. You can look at particular locations, particular cities, points of interest, and what people are associating there. So we have here just a click on Berkeley gets you really the local coverage, and then you might have, and that's the same thing as for a company or a group of companies for locations. You might have a whole region that has a positive perception, and then specific hotspots maybe in there have a more negative association for a particular story. I want to conclude with one example, which is actually an example for both. On the one hand, that you can use these semantic technologies to analyze content, not only to analyze information from others, but to build yourself better search engines that convey the content of your own website in a visual manner. And it's also an example that the technology export and technology transfer is not only always working in one direction from the US to Austria, but that sometimes an Austrian company can actually also work for the US government, which we actually have done. We have now worked for the US government for almost 14 years by building analytic systems, by building search engines for them. For example, you see here the US Climate Resilience Toolkit was powered by our search. It was back in 2014 introduced by then Vice President Joe Biden. And we've also built the current search of climate.gov, so the entry portal for climate change and climate science of the US government. And you see some of our visualization algorithms here in action. So when you go to climate.gov and try to search their own content archive, you see some of these technologies in action. That leads me to my end to my presentation. I don't think we have time for questions now, but I look forward to them afterwards when we have our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our third panelist for the afternoon is Andrew van Schaack. He's Principal Senior Lecturer and Associate Professor at Vanderbilt University. He's also a Fulbright Scholar, and he's a consultant for the United Navy. And I really like how he put into words his research interests, because he says that's forecasting the future in order to prepare for it and developing instructional technologies. So please, tell us more.
So I grew up in Silicon Valley, since the age of 2 years old. And so the perspective that I'm going to bring today is somebody who calls it home and then has worked in companies there for the last 30 years. Silicon Valley wasn't always Silicon Valley. When I was that's all right. It was called Santa Clara Valley, and it was agricultural. In fact, for most of my childhood, we would ride our bicycles through orchards. And still today, California is the largest exporter of agricultural goods of all the states in the United States. When I was a kid growing up, you could earn 50 cents per tray to cut apricots. We put them out in the sun. It was an agricultural community. My parents moved there in 1965 and bought their home for $25,000. And that home today would sell for about $3.5 million. So when you hear people talk about the salaries that people get in Silicon Valley, think about how much they also have to pay for housing. Silicon Valley now doesn't look significantly different in terms of geography than what it used to look like, but where there were orchards before, now there are small, low-rise business complexes that house all the companies that you've heard of. I've gotten a little bit ahead of myself. Silicon Valley started in October of 1957. That was the same month that the Soviet Union launched Sputnik into orbit. And there was this group of 8 gentlemen who defected from a company called Shockley Electronics. They were called the Traitorous 8 and started their own company called Fairchild. Fairchild was really one of the first companies to develop silicon-based products, semiconductors. The very first one was this transistor. A transistor is essentially an electronic switch that replaced vacuum tubes. It had one job, just to switch on and off. And since the late 1950s, the number of transistors that appear or could be on a microprocessor has increased. In fact, it's doubled every 2 years. In fact, it's done so regularly that you have something called Moore's Law. Gordon Moore, who is one of the Traitorous 8, had the observation, as you see here, that the number of transistors doubles every 2 years, and it has since 1970, and it probably will be for another couple of doublings. And this is what really fueled the growth of Silicon Valley, these silicon semiconductors, and then the software companies that came along to build on top of those hardware computers. Now we have companies that produce chips like this that have 2.6 trillion transistors. And these types of technologies are being used for artificial intelligence to speed up the processes and the algorithms that are used for the next generation of software we're going to see. Gordon Moore also said, with respect to Fairchild, every time we came up with a new idea, we spawned 2 or 3 companies to try to exploit it. And that's one of the things that Silicon Valley does. It produces more and more technologies, but companies to produce those technologies. And the children of Fairchild were called Fair Children. In fact, many of the companies of Silicon Valley today can be traced back to that very first company, Fairchild, both through technology as well as the venture capitalists that came out of it. This is Silicon Valley. This is the peninsula that you see, San Francisco near the north. My little hometown of Cupertino is down near the south. And Silicon Valley really was this very small region. Adrian knows it because he lives right in the middle of it. Stanford University is sort of the intellectual home of it. It has since spread a little bit north and a little bit south. This is where all the companies appear. And more recently, that very tip up there in San Francisco, that's where a lot of companies now are starting to show up in terms of Silicon Valley entrepreneurship. Curiously, there are more billionaires per capita in the city of San Francisco than any other city in the United States. That's Vienna, overlaid on top of what we think of as Silicon Valley, just to give you a sense of its size. And also the population is about the same, about 3 million people in Silicon Valley, about 3 million in Vienna. These are the companies that represent Silicon Valley in our minds. I'm sure you recognize many of those companies. But for every one of these companies, there are hundreds of others that you've never heard of that employ people doing really interesting work, really innovative work, probably technologies that you take advantage of every single day. 10 of the top 20 venture capitalists in the world are on this list. They're all Silicon Valley-based venture capitalists, billions of dollars. And you'll notice where they're located. You see Menlo Park up there? That's the street. That's Sand Hill Road, right outside of Palo Alto and Menlo Park. And that's kind of what I remember the valley kind of looking like. You could ride your bikes around. You can still hike around Stanford University. It's very pretty. but that's a lot of the capital that fuels the innovative companies that you hear about. $35.5 billion are poured from these venture capitalists into Silicon Valley companies, and that's only half the money that gets invested in Silicon Valley. There's a lot of money that goes into these companies. Our keynote speech was on this book right here. I read it. I thought it was very interesting, What Tech Calls Thinking. And Dr. Daub mentions a number of different concepts in the book. These are the chapters. Two that I'm going to just talk about just for about a minute apiece are dropping out and failure, two things I know a lot about, so I'm speaking from personal experience. I was a dropout. I was one of those people that dropped out of college and went to work for a company you've heard of, I'm sure, Apple Computer, back in the late 80s. And some of the other people that you may have, or companies you've heard of, were run by dropouts. Now, I didn't make the list because of one very important word that's on that slide, unfortunately. But being a dropout really, I think, is interesting because it's a phenomenon that still exists. There's a company called Y Combinator. They're sort of an accelerator for technology companies. And still today, lots of people that start companies there are dropouts. But curiously, or perhaps not so, 100% of the dropouts are people who attended Harvard, Stanford, or MIT. They have the intellectual horsepower to do what it is that they're doing in these companies, and they say, I don't need any more college to do it. Daniel Kahneman, who you might know from the book Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, Nobel laureate, behavioral economics, said the sunk cost fallacy keeps people for too long in poor jobs, unhappy marriages, and uncompromising research projects, and perhaps college or failed startup companies. And so the idea of people dropping out of college, to me, is not necessarily a bad thing. It's people that are not susceptible to the sunk cost fallacy. I've been in college for 3 years. I could stay in college because I'm almost done, or I could join this tech company. And they decide to join the company. The other concept is failure. Failure, the saying that is very common in Silicon Valley is fail fast, fail often. But the objective, of course, of starting a company is not to fail. Just like when you learn to ski, your objective is not to keep falling, right? But it's going to happen. And what you need to do is learn how to fall less. But the more time you spend on the mountain, the more times you go down the hill, the more often you're going to fail. The objective is, or I tell my students, the opposite of success is not failure. Failure is a requirement success. The key is to learn from your failures. And so what you see in Silicon Valley is fast failure, but lots of learning going on. So that kind of speaks to the formula that I'd like to share with you at the end of this presentation of accelerated evolution. I think that's one formula that drives innovation from Silicon Valley. We know that evolution is mutation and selection, right? Through sexual reproduction, we have offspring that have slightly different characteristics, and then the environment selects for those characteristics that are advantageous. We do that with ideas as well. Failures are companies that don't work well. We abandon them, we move on. We continue on with successful companies and spawn more fair children, if you will. We need fuel to drive this process. That's the venture capital funding that helps to drive this innovation, these companies, and ultimately these failures. And then the formula I'm going to say is when you have a large population, when you have this critical mass in an area like Silicon Valley with lots of smart people and lots of money, and they're innovating frequently, with a large population and quick cycle time, you have accelerated evolution. And another way of saying accelerated evolution is just simply rapid innovation. And Linus Pauling, who won 2 Nobel Prizes, one for chemistry and one for a Nobel Peace Prize, said, if you want to have good ideas, you must have many ideas. Most of them will be wrong, and what you have to learn is which ones to throw away. And that's what Silicon Valley does. They have a lot of companies. They have a lot of innovation. And they have a lot of failures. But they learn from those failures, they move on, they mutate, and they keep spawning better ideas. These are the different decades of technology innovation, and you can see how we've succeeded over the years. It's a little bit of something that Julie was talking about these innovative cycles. We are today on the threshold of the most significant technological advance in the history of mankind. And that's the next innovation of artificial intelligence. This is going to change everything, seriously. And so what I think is interesting and an opportunity for Austria comes from this quote. The founder of Y Combinator says, what it takes is the right people. If you could get the right 10,000 people to move from Silicon Valley to Buffalo, Buffalo, New York, Buffalo would become Silicon Valley. So what's the opportunity in this room? What's the opportunity in this city? If we change the words around to say, what it takes is the right minds. If you could create the right 10,000 minds, Vienna would become the next Silicon Valley. And when we have computers that are as smart or smarter than human beings, those are the minds that you can bring here and potentially create that next innovative cycle, the next Silicon Valley. I'd like to thank Fulbright Austria for making it possible for me to be here, and Johannes Kepler University specifically, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you a little bit more during the panel. Thank you.
I think we got the whole spectrum of ideas we should discuss when we're talking about this topic. Let me just get a sense of how many of you want to contribute. Do you have any questions or remarks on what you have heard? So let's start on the panel here. I think, Adrian, you put it in such perfect words that there's this belief in the myth of Silicon Valley. On the other hand, we have a business reality in Europe that Silicon Valley companies and other tech giants from the US are doing something that we might call colonialism, so pushing out European companies from the market. On the one hand, because they have good technology and better technology sometimes. On the other hand, because they deliberately do not follow the law and use the judicial system in a way that gives them time to do that. That's something you talked about. So I would like to throw this on the panel, because what you said and you demonstrated is that it would very much be possible to have an eye-to-eye relationship if we build our own Silicon Valley in Europe, but that's not the case right now. Right now, it's not an eye-to-eye thing. Right now, it's rather a very powerful US economy, some companies, and a Europe that doesn't really know how to deal with it. And looking towards AI, as you told it, that's something that looks frightening coming out of Europe. So how should Europe and the US build the relationship around this now not very eye-to-eye relationship? Can I hand that to you, Adrian, because you've talked
thank
first.
you. I think that's a great question. There are two things about this that I find so interesting, right? I'm always very laudatory about how the EU regulates tech. And I come from a country, right, I'm from Germany, that, for instance, is very bad at regulating its own car industry. And then I think about the US being bad at regulating its tech industry, and I think, well, gee, it is always easier to regulate an industry that someone else is getting rich off, right? Like there is cynically we might say, you know, unfortunately, like maybe we wouldn't wish Silicon Valley upon Vienna, because then people would get bad at regulating it. But I think you're right that there is of course that's totally different. Sorry. Hope you were all still able to hear me. But I think that's exactly right. There is a fear around it that's justifiable. That the language of innovation is to some extent hiding power politics, and to some extent it is. And I think while I think the question of failure, for instance, it's absolutely right what you said, that of course that companies succeed on the merits sometimes in Silicon Valley. I had a really interesting conversation once with a guy who, if you create a startup and it fails and you're too young and you never drew up the right papers, it's a nightmare to actually unwind a company. And this guy comes in and he buys the company off of you for nothing, and he has lawyers who just kind of destroy the company for you. And he holds all their IP, all their intellectual property. He says, from where he's sitting, which is just on a pile of Silicon Valley's also rans, is to say a lot of them weren't better, they were just first, right? The ones that, he's like, I own the second of everything, right? I own the people who came up with the thing that everyone went wild about, like 10 seconds after someone else filed the patents, right? And they worked for one more year thinking they could pivot, and then they couldn't. So it's true that time, power plays, and then, a kind of casualness with a regulatory environment has become an aspect of this. I don't think it's always been true of Silicon Valley, right? Fairchild is a good example of this. I feel like their regulatory environment, right? I mean, they became big polluters, one has to say, at a time when the EPA was, in fact, regulating them quite aggressively, and they were still able to be as amazingly successful as they were. But definitely the new crop has largely succeeded in you know, through regulative capture, right? Through buying kind of you never can buy yourself out of it entirely, but you can make sure it takes long enough, right, for Johnny Law to catch up with you that you can become rich in the meantime, right? So I do think that this factor of time and the factor of, you know, I have in the book the line about innovation, right? Innovation, there is a lot of innovation in Silicon Valley, but there are also things that are called innovation that are just like exploitation of a regulatory lag, the fact that the government hasn't figured out what you're doing yet. And I think that's part of the story as well, and that does make it harder than to replicate.
Julie, you said that what you want to discuss about it, I think that's an excellent point, is what the US should bring to the table in when we talk about regulation and also following the regulation, because as Adrian said, that's one of the problems, is that if you see, I mean, my company has sued Google, for example, in 2014, and we're still on it because they just draw out the process and become rich in the meantime, exactly what you say. So what can the US bring to the table in this relationship of regulatory environment and keeping companies accountable, which I think is one of the big issues in the relationships right now?
Well, that's a great question. I think since, as I mentioned, 4 of the 5 most valuable companies in the world are U.S. digital firms, it matters what the U.S. digital regulatory environment is like. Mm-hmm. And there's been a discussion that there currently is no dedicated, focused federal oversight agency in the United States for this. And that's of concern. So what can the U.S. do? The U.S. could start a conversation with Europe, and really, I think, to some degree, look to Europe. You know, Europe has provided policy leadership in this area. This is something Europe has spent a lot of time and energy on. You don't have to reinvent the wheel entirely. I think that the EU model can be looked to, and the U.S. has to take the regulatory environment seriously. And I think, of course, firms are going to push back, and industries are going to push back a little bit. Nobody likes to be regulated. I don't like to be regulated. But, you know, we have pointed to the fact that maintaining competition and innovation is a very important function of regulation. And then, in addition, addressing the negative externalities associated with the industry. So these are both 2 very good motivations for the U.S. to do this. I think the U.S. has been talking a little bit more about developing regulation, but there needs to be a lot more conversation going on. And it does need to be harmonious to be effective. So in other words, the U.S. does need to have conversations with EU counterparts in order to form a comprehensive environment.
Arno, what's your view on this as the tech guy who, of course, I suppose, doesn't believe too much in over-regulation, as you might call it?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I mean, there are several questions involved here. One is actually why, you know, is there a competitive advantage, or, you know, why are there so many companies in Silicon Valley? And I think it boils down to several reasons, and I think now it's a very different market, because back then, when it was actually created, I mean, it's in the name Silicon Valley, it's semiconductors, it's mainframes, these are like huge investments. And that's also the source of funding you have in Austria and in the you know, I showed some of our grants that we got, but that's mostly public funding. We don't have such a developed private funding ecosystem. So we didn't have this initial funding, but now it's actually a completely different type of game, because now it's the opposite. You can actually create an information system, an app, and become really successful, but you don't need an investment of 10 million euros into that. So I think that's they're still benefiting from the advantage they had then, when it was a completely different type of game. And as you said, you know, I'm not completely in line with some of, or with all of the recent regulatory environments, but I see that there has to be some in some areas. And there's actually one, in my opinion, problematic aspect that we see now with all the platforms. Namely their walled garden, and if you followed some of the speeches of Tim Berners-Lee, who who was a central person in the evolution of the World Wide Web, he complained that these companies creating walled gardens. So the spirit of the web was free information. You have a website, everyone can access it, can analyze it, which we also do with the technology I presented. And now you have these walled gardens. You can only get into the, I don't want to name a specific platform, but you have to log in and then you are in this walled garden. And this walled garden is not accessible to outsiders. So you are at the mercy of these platforms, for example, to analyze the public debate. There are different players. Twitter, for example, is a better player. They give you a lot of information you can analyze and can then infer knowledge about the public debate. Other platforms, they are very restrictive. So you might have an election in Austria. There is a lot of public debate on a platform such as Facebook. And there's no way as any company, no European company, no European policymaker actually can analyze this public debate. Although this, I'm not talking about any private information. So it would be important to keep the private information private and protect it at all costs. But that communication that people consciously put out as public, and I want to participate on the public debate on an upcoming election, that should be mandatory. If I make money with it, with that debate and by running ads on that debate, I should also be required to provide this public debate to everyone, meaning you have these data interfaces called APIs, and I think that should be open to everyone because then you have a fully transparent public debate which is now sort of hidden and not accessible to many companies, policymakers and other stakeholders.
You show me when you want to say something, okay? Or when you want to raise a question. Andrew, how would you characterize the relationship between US and Europe in this tech giant environment right now? And where should it head to after what you've heard?
Yeah, I think, well, one interesting fact about Silicon Valley is more than 50% of the companies that start up are started up by foreign-born citizens or individuals that come from other parts of the world. 75% of the workers in the STEM field come from different parts of the world. So a lot of Silicon Valley is represented by people from around the world. And I think that's where a lot of technology transfer happens. You know, you're taking some technology into the United States. The United States is bringing some technology here. Programs like the Fulbright program, where you have exchange of scholars and students, is a great way of doing technology transfer. So I think we're going to see more partnerships between companies as we develop closer relationships. I think with respect to the comments earlier about regulatory issues, it's always going to lag technology. Technology just innovates so quickly, and it takes a while for us to see what that technology will do. Clearly, the marketing department says here are all the wonderful intended consequences of these technologies, but then we find unintended, delayed, negative consequences. And then we say, wow, we need to regulate this, but it will always lag behind. And so I think that's going to be sort of the perennial challenge of, we want rapid innovation, don't we? We talk about it all the time. How do we do that? But with rapid innovation is negative social consequences that drive the need for regulatory issues, and then how fast does our political and legal system work to catch up to that? I think that's going to be the challenge.
Not necessarily some innovations, because there are some innovations that actually are the win-win, and those are the best ones.
Ideal, yes. Yeah.
Please. Yes, I think we got a mic. I think that might be easier for everybody to understand in the room.
Thank you very much. Karl Humberg from EDM. Probably a question to Mr. Schaak. You have shown this nice photo of 1960 semiconductors. But nowadays, how is the situation? I mean, the most advanced semiconductors are produced in Taiwan, and the US is dependent, to some extent also China. And given the tensions of nowadays, are there any plans to have more production in the US again? Do you know anything about that? Yeah. Europe is not in a better situation, by the way. Thank you.
Sure. There are still very, very large semiconductor companies that are located in the United States and in Silicon Valley. Intel, AMD, Advanced Micro Devices, I mean, huge companies. But it's also true that offshoring those companies or producing semiconductors in the region where they're going to be produced makes smart business sense as well. We have to be very careful, of course, because when you're producing semiconductors, you can also put in lots of malicious code and other things you want those chips to do, put them in phones, ship those phones around the world, and now we have sort of embedded spyware. So I think there is this challenge, no doubt about it, as we increase the globalization of the manufacture of semiconductors into regions all around the world. We have to be careful not to become sole-sourced maybe with a Chinese company that's producing a particular type of chip. So there is more discussion about onshoring and bringing back lots of semiconductor manufacturing around critical components and technologies that we all take advantage of. But I didn't put it up on the slide because when I said here are the companies from Silicon Valley, there's 12 companies that were all chip-making companies that you've never heard of. Xilinx is a big one. I mean, there's just tons of these Cypress semiconductors that if I put those up there, you don't know them. You know Yahoo, you know Apple, you know Facebook. Still, lots of semiconductor manufacturing happening still in California.
Thank you very much. We've got a question here. We got the microphone.
Where?
Here.
I want to bridge back to the Austrian maybe basis of this discussion. You remember Peter Ferner Drucker, son of a so-called Sektionschef im Finanzministerium, created the theory of knowledge economy and knowledge society. And on the other hand, Fritz Machlup, member of the Austrian School of Economics, described in the early 50s the influence of inventions on the economic wealth and wealth creation in the United States. On the other hand, he destroyed the Bretton Woods systems by his analysis. And, Peter Drucker died 20 years ago. He published this forecast in the early 70s. And his theory is that the transformation or revolutionary thing is that we produce science by science or processing science with science. And therefore, my answer to Detroit or not Detroit, it's Vienna.
That's a good answer. We saw that geographically it would be possible, right? Thank you for that map.
Right.
Do you want to answer that right away? It was actually more of a remark than a question, which is very welcome. Do we have any more? Yes, please. Here. And then.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the question of regulation, and one of the things that stood out in Adrian's talk was the issue of labor and the attempt to actually regulate labor. And so I have kind of two questions, one for Adrian and one for Julie, is what kinds of new labor arrangements and what is the visibility of labor within tech and within the myth, because that's one thing about Detroit, is labor's visible, and labor movements and all the things coming out of that. And then to Julie, just kind of, we're talking about the regulatory environment and in terms of labor, but then one of the points with Adrian was well, when it's monopoly, we actually tried to regulate labor and they said, we don't care. And, this is the way it's going to be. And, we'll leave California if you don't like it. And so those are the two questions.
If you want, I'll go first. Yeah, so I think that there's two very different types of labor in the equation for Silicon Valley, right? We've got advanced education, technical people, but some of the issues were involving Uber drivers that I believe Adrian was bringing up. And that gets to the issue of what is a gig economy. Employers who do not want to provide benefits for their employees call them non-employees. They simply work there for money, but they're not employees. So they're, that gets at I think, a very fundamental social economic distribution issue. And I think, that's something which I think a lot of people in California were watching that. Yeah. So I think there's two different issues, one of which is there needs to be a critical mass of an educated workforce to have a situation like Silicon Valley take place. Those are the innovators. And then that's perhaps one group within the labor force. And then there's this other issue of sometimes monopolistic firms taking very aggressive positions and saying that some employees or some workers for their firm are not employees. And I think the reason for that is clear, and I think Adrian is ready to follow up on that.
I think that's also a really interesting part in Austria-US relations, what we're talking here. If you take the case of Uber, that was something that Austria took up and regulated it, much to the dismay of Uber users. But that was a large discussion, right?
I think it's important to note, right? I mean, like when we think of regulation of tech companies, we often first go to, we think Facebook, and I do think labor is ultimately labor and frankly wealth regulation. I'll say more about that in a second. But so first off, I think that the regulation of labor is a really important part of this, and especially in Silicon Valley, as I try to show in my book, it intersects with a particular ideology of labor that is quite old because. Fairchild, for instance, premiered this very new way of innovative way of working together, et cetera, where they did this right down the street from these extremely tightly organized and hierarchical manufacturing places where it's largely women doing this extremely painstaking work of putting together the semiconductors. So like they had, from the very beginning, their innovation sort of stopped at the factory floor. And to me, I have to say that does sound like an early ancestor to the way Uber is a great place to work, unless you drive for Uber, right? Like it's a fantastic place to be employed if you're actually employed, right? I've been to their headquarters. It's lovely, and I don't think they allow drivers in, as far as I know. I mean, maybe that's not true anymore, but they're not part of the team in that way. And then the other kind of regulation that I think sometimes doesn't get mentioned, and we're still, I think, we've mentioned it a couple of times now, is where does the VC money come from, right? We say there's really, you showed that amazing amount of VC money. A lot of it, as far as I know, does come from under-regulated capital markets, right, to some extent. A lot of that's money, sovereign money, a lot of that's Saudi, a lot of that's SoftBank, a lot of that is sorry, but people maybe whose fortunes could stand a little diminution, let's say, like if they were to share their oil wealth with their subjects. And the other thing is the initial, right? So the Fairchilds of the world, the Fairchildren were one kind of innovation that really kickstarted what we see today at Silicon Valley on the tech side. On the scale side and on the failure cycle side, the fact that you could throw this much money at the problem, which you can't necessarily in Austria, is that these were sort of the Rockefellers. These were the so-called family offices that came to California in the 1960s and sort of they bought up little properties around Stanford's campus and said, don't give us freaking real estate, we don't care about orange groves, buy us some clever nerdy tech and make us bundle on that. To me that says that one of the regulations that Europe has that keeps it from being Silicon Valley is that you tax inheritance, right? If you want the rich to get super rich, you can have huge VCs. I just worry. I don't know whether one would want to wake up in that world right now. So I do think that people can come down on that any way they'd like, but I do think it's important to note that one form of regulation, one form of sort of Initialzündung, one thing that really birthed Silicon Valley was just a massive centralization of wealth, and that's another regulation we don't talk about.
So that would make Austria a good place for Silicon Valley because we don't tax inheritance here, actually.
Oh my goodness, you're all set. You're all set. Wow.
I know Germans are always like, what?
Wow.
No excuses now, right?
We're one of these countries. Yeah. We have one more question over there and one here in the first row. Let's take you first, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Corinna. I just wanted to add another notion to this discussion. That's why I came in at this particular moment. I've read a recent interview of Peter Thiel, and he was very outspoken, saying that basically he regards states, the whole question of national sovereignty, governments, as a nuisance and an obstacle in the sort of his way of progress. Yeah?
Which is funny for a person making money off governments, right? Yeah, because that's his business.
But still, I'm sure that many of the people who were on the list here think perhaps less outspoken, but think on the same lines. And I cannot imagine that somebody who is in this mindset will take kindly to the whole question of regulation. So where are we heading here? Are we heading here into a sort of a power play? Who is stronger, the platform or the government? How is this going to come out? Yeah, and who will be stronger in the long run?
Thank you so much. Such an important topic. I'll take the next question right away, because we're running out of time, right? I'll ask the organizers, how much time do we have left?
3 minutes, about. My question's related. I wanted to ask about the dark side of innovation, because Roger McNamee, whose name might be familiar to you, was one of the big venture capitalists who financed companies like Facebook. And he saw what was happening in the elections and with Facebook's role, and he turned very much against Facebook. And the question is, you know, as an American, I grew up with this idea that innovation is great and too much regulation is bad. And now I'm starting to see all these dark things, spying on people. As a researcher into genocide, I see how technology is used in order to kill millions of people. And the question is, do we need regulation? Or is there some other way that we can get that under control?
That's such an interesting question. We should go into the coffee break now, but the coffee break is 45 minutes, so I would ask you for another 5 to 10 to finish the conversation here, because these are really interesting topics. I'll hand it over to you.
I do have a few thoughts on this. So there was a mention earlier about over-regulation. There's bad regulation. There's too much regulation sometimes. I mean, I'm talking about good regulation, effective regulation, regulation that involves the stakeholders, right? That's when it gets effective. So when you've got the tech firms at the table, the policymakers, and consumers, or somebody who represents the consumer's interests, and talking about the issues at hand. So that's the first thing I want to say about regulation. And regulation isn't, I know some people associate regulation with harming firms. As an economist, I think just the opposite. Why would you do that, right? You want firms to do well, right? What you want to do is make sure that monopolists are not squeezing out and killing small innovative firms through buy and bury strategies, right? That kills innovation. And that happens, and that is the very foundation of the FTC lawsuit against Facebook. So when we talk about regulation, you know, there's different kinds of regulation, right? And it needs to be mindful. And where are we going to end up with it? Are the firms going to have the upper hand, or are the government's going to have the upper hand? And again, I can't say this strongly enough. You know, you need to have all the stakeholders involved with the process, or it's not going to be effective. And I think if you let the firms dictate, they're going to dictate what's best for them. If you let the government dictate, it's got its own interests. It's a lot more work to get everybody involved, but I think that's the only way it's going to work.
Yes, please.
So I personally think that regulation is important, because it's just not a level playing field between regions, but also within a country. It's just, you know, you're not starting, not everyone is starting from scratch. So I think that calls for regulation. What I think is sometimes missing, that regulation is seen as a political process, and then you have sort of the other stakeholders, like the companies. And then, you know, you have some, they do consultation, but that's consultation light. So I think there should be a much more genuine and active dialogue between technology companies of all sizes, from, you know, the small SMEs to the large ones, with the policymakers to jointly come up with regulation, because it's a very nuanced field. You need a very in-depth knowledge about everything from privacy to copyright to any technology regulations. And the devil is in the detail. And even if you're then well-intentioned, put something in place that you have not properly discussed with a lot of the people who are developing this technology, then you might have a problem, and you might actually not achieve what started out with a good goal.
So I'd like to take this to a final round on the podium.
I thought I'd briefly say something, because I think there's a really interesting kind of twist to this kind of sovereignty and regulation question, right? On the one hand, I think with just to take two examples, one of the interesting things as Elon Musk was preparing to buy Twitter, which he may or may not do, right? One of the things he said is he wanted to only disallow speech that violated the First Amendment, which was basically he was saying, no corporate entity in the United States has to abide only by the First Amendment. Because you're a private actor, you're absolutely allowed to censor speech because you have your own speech rights. So Disney doesn't have to put your horrifying cartoon on the air because Disney has a right to free speech. So he wanted to basically substitute it as an implicit government actor, which of course was a kind of claim to sovereignty, to national sovereignty for this company. Now, the funny thing is that I happen to know a lot of people who work there, and they were all slapping their foreheads because they said, it makes no business sense. Imagine a Twitter where anything could happen. Who would want to be on this thing? It would be a horrifying nightmare that you wouldn't want to spend more than a minute on. It would make no money. And initially that really relieved me, and I would have given you that as an answer. I was like, don't worry about it. National sovereignty likely will win out because they need to make money. But then I thought, well, what if he doesn't need to make money anymore? What if this is just a lark? What if he says, I will do this, and if it costs me billions of dollars every year? That's the question. If the stakeholder you're involving is no longer acting according to good business sense, but is ultimately responding to a feudal logic, that's where I think we're going to get into some really interesting questions. And just to give one last point about that, turns out one of the people that Elon Musk consulted with before he made this clearly money-losing bid on Twitter was Peter Thiel. So.
Yeah, and then he's got political ambitions.
Right.
So let's take this last round. Topic here is the relationships between US and Austria and how to recharge them. If you look at them from the point of Silicon Valley companies, you've got a real clash. We've seen that in the discussion now. You've got Airbnb versus the Austrian tourism industry. You've got Uber versus the highly regulated taxi industry in Austria, and so on. So you could frame that as power politics in business, just taking over markets. You could frame it as the old versus the new. You could also frame it as Peter Thiel's libertarian ideas versus government and the European sense of society. But however you frame it, it's not in balance right now. And if we take it to the next level, and that's what I would like to ask you for the final round, which is AI. There's some regulation being drafted, but that's an uncharted territory largely. So what perspective and what potential do you see for Austria and the US in this relationship? Can I ask you to start?
Specifically with respect to AI?
Well, let's say to the future. But I guess that will be AI if we talk about Silicon Valley, right?
And I think it's going to be everywhere. I think, and I wasn't exaggerating when I believe that AI is going to be the most significant technological innovation in the history of mankind. It's going to change everything. And I think what's exciting is that research can be done anywhere. Right? That research can be done at universities here. That research could be done at universities in India or in California. Now, some of the most advanced research is being done at companies like Google and OpenAI, and they happen to have their engineers in Silicon Valley. But again, they have offices all around the world, and lots of foreign-born individuals are working for those companies. So I think that the way that Silicon Valley can work with, or the United States can work with Austria and back and forth, is through the types of exchanges that are represented here on this panel. Right? Look who's on this panel. Look who we represent. Why are we in this room? Right? We're here because we're doing exchanges. Right? We're doing intellectual exchanges. We're doing exchanges of technology. We're creating business partnerships. I think it's going to happen that way. But I do think that there could be a hub right here at one of these universities in JKU. Johannes Kepler University has a research department doing work in AI. It just takes a couple of really smart graduate students working with a associate professor late into the night to develop innovations. Right? It can happen really anywhere. So.
Thank you. Julie, can I give you the floor for this?
Could you repeat the question?
If you take your presentation about regulation, if you take it into the future, when we talk about other technologies like AI, and you see this imbalance that we have right now, what do you think is the right way to go for Austria and US in the relationship?
Boy, that's a huge question. I'll answer a question that I think I might know the answer to, rather than that, because I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. When I showed the Chondroitin cycles, the last cycle I showed was in just after the year 2000. So if you add another 50 years, the question is, what's going to be the next innovation on there? And this is where Andy and I I was thinking we disagree, but maybe there's some overlap. I think the next big area is going to be biotechnology. And he said AI, but you know what? I was just reading today about AI in biotechnology, so they're not mutually exclusive, are they? Right. That's where I would invest if I had any money.
I think I'll pick up on the artificial intelligence. One has to look at the various aspects of artificial, because now it's a hype term and it's used for a variety of things. So it's probably hundreds of technologies that are now packed into AI, from symbolic AI expert systems to machine learning. And I think when you showed the slide with the cycles, I think it's also very interesting when you look at AI, because it's sort of now the second wave of AI. We already had it in the 70s, 80s, where people actually were already hyping AI, and they were even more ambitious in their thoughts. They thought, in 10 years we're going to have sentient machines, which is, it still hasn't happened. It's not going to happen for a while, if ever. So the jury is still out on that. So what we see now is actually, in a way, our expectations are more modest. We're not believing in sentient machines in 5 years. But the impact is much more dramatic because it's everywhere, because now you have these language models and they're underlying so many different applications and systems and technologies. So it's interesting. With more modest expectations, you're creating 1,000 times the impact, and in that notion I agree. It will be the enabler. It is something where our company is a good example. We can participate as a small player. There are some aspects AI, like language models, for example, which require billions of documents.
Right.
And luckily they're actually provided by big players such as Google to the research community,
Right.
but you could not calculate them yourselves. So there's also a certain dependency here, which at the moment is not a problem because it's freely given,
Right.
but you couldn't do it from scratch.
Thank you very much. So Adrian, I'll give you the last word. How's the myth going to change?
Well, I think the best I can put it is that I think maybe we've stopped worrying about a single future, right? Silicon Valley is a very specific place, and its hype largely consists of identifying a possible and very plausible and very attractive design of the future with the future too cool as such, right? And I think my guess is that there are aspects of the AI race, as far as I can tell, that other parts of the world likely aren't going to be able to catch up with Silicon Valley for. But the question is, would you want to, right? There's an awful lot of conformism also in this innovation. Everyone kind of rushes down one alley, and there's also a lot of other interesting work being done, but it's not getting all the attention. It's not getting the VC money. I mean, there were times, the money in Silicon Valley tends to follow trends, which leaves a lot of space for other countries to configure things differently. I think aping Silicon Valley is always a losing gamble, because it turns out with $100 billion you can just do that a lot better. But I think that freeing oneself from the fact that there's sort of one arrow pointing one way, and to rather sort of maybe work closer with other stakeholders, work more closely with universities, have a different relationship to profit, to profit margins, right? I mean, the fact that if someone's giving you $1 billion, that thing better make some money at some point, right? If you've taken a tenth of that, you can be a lot more relaxed about what you're doing. So my guess is it has to kind of just these things are not measured on one scale here, and I think that Europeans having and Austrians having the courage of their own convictions, and having and kind of consciously uncoupling from the kind of hypercharged environments, not just in the United States but also in China and India, I think is ultimately probably strikes me as not a bad way to go.
Great, that's an optimistic end to the panel. Thank you very much for your presentations and for the discussion. And let's go into the coffee break. Thank you.